Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, waking the dead about an hour after they died. The unfortunate reality that not all treatments are actually a treatment, and at least one kind of brain disease can be treated, but that treatment causes cancer. A form of insulin called smart insulin, which is supposed to help with diabetes far more effectively. America experiences a variety of disease outbreaks related to food, whether it's E. coli, listeria, or anything else you can think of at the moment. What the nightmarishly sized crab head looks like. The roughly 3 meter or 9 foot crab has before now gone unknown, and there's a good argument to be made that some people would have preferred it to remain unknown. Some people fail to understand just what goes on when you fund research, and that yes, there will inevitably be some relationship between various drug researchers, primarily in pharmaceutical sciences, and major medical drug developers, because what they want to do is pay these people to start the work and then buy it off them later. Another major development in the same vein is Elsevier going public, and the shit show that has led to. Why it is that not everybody is the smartest of hackers, so to say, and the stupidity associated with using your own email address when trying to rip off the US government. And finally, Elon Musk is being sued over images related to Blade Runner 2049. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the most interesting of news this week. The ability to effectively revive a dead pig an hour after it has died, which means there should effectively be no brain function, and what brain function there would have been has been so crippled by a lack of oxygen and other metabolic processes that it is completely ruined. Yet, Chinese researchers have managed to effectively revive that pig an hour after death. That hour, as said, when it should effectively be completely decimated and unable to recover in any way, shape or form. This whole process takes us several steps closer to being able to resurrect the dead humans, or piece them together and create our own Frankenstein's monster. Ever closer to what we really want. As nightmarish and dystopian as this may sound, there is good reason to be investigating it, and it's relatively simple. There are a lot of instances where, due to a lack of blood flow to the brain, effectively ischemia, you have issues around, people dying, and the longer you can extend the time frame after they've supposedly died and resuscitate them, the better. It means there's a better chance that we can, resurrect them. Understand, necromancy is the ultimate level of healing, because the healer literally hasn't given up even after death. The way they've done this is rather straightforward. Take a number of pigs, 17, and effectively block off their liver. The liver blocked off and then subjected to brain ischemia, they then reopen the liver blood flow to some of these pigs. And that seems to be the major thing here. The liver needed to be involved in the resuscitation of the pigs, otherwise it doesn't work the way they thought it would. Although there are a lot of questions as to why and how. This will, however, not allow you to put your brain inside of a glass jar for all intents and purposes, and control Vegas. Instead, you have about 6 hours or so, and that's about all they can establish. That 6 hours is because they had to end the experiment, and unfortunately that's not likely to be enough to save your life necessarily. Shifting to less exciting and useful news, we have your toothbrush, and the fact that it's actually a rather terrifying biological weapon. It's full of viruses and who knows what else, given what and how you might be using said toothbrush. This, of course, comes from the USA, where Northwestern University researchers basically swabbed a toothbrush, shower head, and a variety of other places to see what they could get growing on a petri plate. If you've ever tried this experiment yourself in, say, a first year of microbiology, you would have a good idea about what might be found, and why it might be truly terrifying. Imagine what it's like just being a first year university student, and now imagine if they start swapping themselves and growing whatever microbial organisms might be growing on their body, or anywhere else they choose to put the swab. Yeah, this is why a toothbrush is a very worrying place to be looking for. Particularly in regards to this as well, they found viruses in particular, which is even more concerning again. What is amazing to see is that they didn't find any kind of STDs, or is it STI now, on the toothbrushes. And going to more useful, although in all the wrong ways, news, we have clinical trial developments for brain disease that unfortunately also caused cancer, which technically is a treatment, as death cures all. The original trial was an FDA-approved gene therapy looking at cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, and yes, it does appear to at least help with that condition. The downside is that, well, it also causes a kind of cancer. It's a myelodysplastic syndrome, so yeah, that's not great. However, it is only 1 in 11 or so patients who will develop that condition. It was 6 out of 67 participants, so the risks are low. And it would be even lower again if they can figure out what's going on, why, and stop it from happening. But that of course assumes a lot of research. One of the things that's going to be particularly challenging here is that the brain disease itself, the cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, is mostly affecting females, given it's an X-linked condition. And because of that, there are all sorts of problems around trying to figure out what's going on and how to solve it. And also, to a certain extent, the relative reticence to develop treatments that cause such massive problems. This is where the fairly big problem with this particular finding lies, or lays. The treatment has effectively been given the green light, that is, the FDA has approved it, which kind of makes sense. Without treatment, there's about an 8-year survival rate, so most people die within 8 years of being diagnosed. With treatment, that window of life effectively extends massively, and theoretically for life. But, of course, it also means that with a 1 in 11 chance of developing cancer, your treatment may or may not be a long-term prospect. In other cancer-related news, we have the UK results from the National Health Service. Effectively, they've published research, or more accurate to say, data, on and up to 2022.
Well, Rudolph, we finally figured out what makes your nose red.
Is it pixie dust or leprechaun tails?
No, it's a tumor.
You mean like a magical Christmas tumor?
No, a malignant tumor, the base of which is lodged deep within your brain.
Oh. Like a happy special...
You're going to die.
Now, it's very important to note that there is a major drop at one point, and everybody's well aware of what caused that. It starts with C and ends with, oh crap, we're in lockdown. What is important here is that it addresses these various claims around nonsense things like turbo cancer and similar, and how cancer is only caused because the vaccine rolled out and other bullshit. No. And you can see that the number of deaths from cancer has continued to go down year on year as a whole category. The number of instances of cancer has gone up at the same time. So effectively, since 2006 or there-ish, you could argue that you may be diagnosed with cancer, but you have a better chance of survival. Now, this is a combination of both a greater testing and identification of cancer, but also better treatment for cancer. Therefore, people may be identified or diagnosed with it, but they will survive, or at least survive for longer.
Sorry, kid.
That's all right.
A nice baby.
I'm not a baby, I'm a tumor.
And this is the key here. Unlike other claims, no, there is not a drastic increase. It has been a consistent and reliable increase, barring nonsense around COVID-19. You'll find the link to the full thread in the description box below, but understand these same general trends apply almost regardless of country, with some exceptions such as America, where healthcare and particularly oncology generally involves selling your firstborn off to some sort of eldritch being. In more useful kind of medical development, we have a smart insulin. Smart in that, well, it's not going to kill you immediately and could theoretically be somewhat more useful in managing blood glucose levels. The theory, and understand we say theory for a very good reason, is that it would be able to be activated and deactivated as needed based on blood glucose levels. Essentially, the insulin itself acts like the hormone regulators normally involved in having your pancreas secrete insulin, or in other times glucagon. Now, understand, because of what diabetes is, some people just don't have the necessary cells to make insulin. This is what type 1 diabetes is. In the case of type 2 diabetes, things are a little more complicated, as that can be a number of things, but for the purpose of this video, let's just assume it's insulin resistance. What they're looking at here is by using a structural change in the nature of the insulin, they're able to allow for it to be conformationally changed and become active when there is glucose present. This means that when insulin is nearby to the necessary thing for it to be used for, that being sugar or glucose, it changes its shape and becomes active, allowing cells to then take up as much of that glucose as it realistically can. This does involve a considerable amount of biochemical engineering in order to make these shapes and get everything right, but it's certainly not impossible, and certainly feasible in theory. But there's a massive gap between the theoretical application of this and the practical application, and of course, actually having it work in reality as you want it to, and not just how you think it might, as demonstrated with the brain disease treatment. Shifting now to more environmental news, but looking at food instead. And it's an interesting thread looking at the IARC, or World Health Organization, monograph, let's call it? No, let's be blunt. A hit piece on red meat. And essentially it points out similar issues as what we've seen elsewhere, particularly around things like a glyphosate, where the IARC already had a conclusion, and all they really wanted to do was find the necessary information to support that conclusion, even if that conclusion was not correct. And unfortunately, as the very first post in this thread points out, the general idea was, if you were trying to present any view contrary to the conclusion, that being red meat causes cancer, you were told to shut up and say nothing, and ideally do nothing. Now, the monograph itself is essentially nonsense. Understand, there are, of course, some things that pose greater risk, but you need to understand that there is both risk, which is, can this actually do that? In other words, a gun is dangerous, there is a certain risk to it, but is there actually a probability of it causing that harm? Now, in the case of red meat, you would have to consume a ridiculous amount of it for there to be an actual risk of harm, and the probability to be high enough for it to occur. For a gun, well, the circumstances are going to vary drastically. If you're in a war zone, the probability is very high. If you're in an American school, the probability is reasonably modest. If you're in a civilized country, the probability is probably fairly low. This is where the IARC and World Health Organization continues to lose, at least scientific support, in that scientists who are actually aware of what's going on increasingly look at their monographs and other publications and go, in what world do you live that this is reality? And worse yet, what kind of hellish world is this that you can actually say that? Mostly it's because either it's issues to do with the quality of the data, that the data itself and the conclusions were incredibly weak, or that there was exceptional probability of bias, and that in cases of certain diseases, understand there are some pretty serious risks when we say that, the conditions on which you could apply the increased risk of cancer were very narrow. That is, for example, it may only be colorectal cancer, but no other cancers at all. And therein lies the problem. The IARC monograph has basically taken what should be a narrowly tailored set of conditions under which red meat could be a problem and contributing to cancer, and then tried to paint every red meat, arguably every meat, with that brush and make them all look like they're bad and evil. Next we have the exciting times involved with, America again, but this time the joy of giving school children food poisoning. Well, joy may not be quite the right word, but the issue is rather straightforward. Various foods have been made available to school kids. Calling it a food is perhaps generous, but they have been made available. And the problem with this is very simple. The food contained listeria, and the food was then eaten by children, and the children now have food poisoning. Good times for all. The porcelain throne gets its offerings from both ends, and the companies get paid to make kids sick. Yeah, we're perhaps being somewhat facetious, but the issue isn't exactly a minor thing. First of all, it's a lot of meat that has to be recalled because of this. 10 million pounds, or roughly 5 million kilograms if we're going to use civilized numbers. This meat can be found in frozen dinners, salads, and it's sold in various places, whether it's Walmart, Target, Trader Joe's, Kroger, and everywhere else, and apparently includes where it was served at schools. So yeah. Now, this does get even more messy again, because it very much depends on what it is as to who's responsible for this in terms of government regulation. Depending on what it's served as, whether it's part of a pre-made meal, a chicken independent of everything else, and so on, it could be the United States Department of Agriculture, or it could be the FDA. And this is where things get very difficult to figure out who's actually responsible, and who it is that had to spend a lot of time finding the 326 pages of items that needed to be recalled. Chicken is not the only exciting meat in America that's leading to issues. The Quarter Pounder, McDonald's signature food of a kind, is also experiencing similar problems, but that's due to E. coli this time. And unfortunately, compared to the previous news item, this has been arguably worse. Not worse in that it's affected fewer people. Fortunately, there were only 49 infections. But worse in that it's actually managed to kill someone. Yes, killing children would be worse, by the way. The important thing here is that although there are 49 people who've been infected, 10 of them were hospitalized, and particularly one elderly individual has died, so there are certain mitigating factors in terms of elderly people are more likely to die when they're, well, any kind of ill, and not just E. coli infection. Also worth noting is that the majority of the infections that have occurred have been spread across only a few states, mostly Colorado and Nebraska, but most of the other 4 continental US states that have been infected by this have also withdrawn the Quarter Pounder as a result, which we can hope it stays that way, given that it's neither a Quarter Pounder nor food and isn't fit for human consumption at the best of times. What makes this particularly newsworthy is that it's the same strain of E. coli that is found in all of the individuals that have been tested, this being the 0157:H7 strain. And pretty much it's nasty, and it's worth noting because, well, you don't want to have it within you. It's not the worst out there, but it's bad enough that, well, yeah, you definitely don't want to be infected. In similar news, but this time related to humanity as a whole and food as a whole, it's a noteworthy tweet, or sheet, or whatever you wish to call them now. It's from Simon Mitchelling, and what's important to look at is that despite all of the complaints about humanity, food, and everything else, our food supply and the population has effectively been in the best state it's almost ever been, barring roughly 20 or so years ago where things were a little bit tighter between the poorest and the average, but there was still a massive gap between the average and the richest. It very much puts in context just how lucky we are to be alive today. Whether or not we stay alive in the ongoing future is a different matter, and, well, one solution to solve climate change might put a hold on that. It's the idea that we could essentially seed the sky full of diamonds and help cool the planet. Or cause diamond-based projectiles to fall down on Earth like carpet bombs and destroy everything, which would theoretically solve the issue of climate change by removing humanity, or a large chunk of it. Understand, the idea is not without any kind of merit. It's just a very zany idea, and sounds more like a Bond villain than science. It's also, interestingly enough, Swiss research, which adds to the Bond villain vibes. The work itself is based on the idea that if you take diamonds and you seed them in the sky, you're effectively able to reflect light more effectively. Now, that by itself doesn't seem like it's particularly helpful. After all, you would think we want light, and yes, we do to an extent. But what we don't want is light penetrating its way all the way through the atmosphere and entering into the part of the Earth's atmosphere where we retain the heat. This would, in a manner of speaking, basically be a giant reflective blanket over a large swath of the atmosphere, preventing a lot of the light from getting in here, thereby preventing cooling from, well, having the effect that we're expecting to see. However, and this is the big however, there is a very fine line between getting this right and getting this horribly wrong. If we were to seed it too extensively and too richly, we would have the problem that, well, Earth would start cooling not just rapidly, but in a way that we couldn't recover the heat. If we don't do enough of it, well, it won't have the desired effect, at least not to the extent we need it to have. Going now from very modern news, or arguably even future news, to ancient news and, well, 3-meter tall crabs and what their face finally looks like, which may or may not be nightmare-inducing for you. Understand, this crab is less of a crab in the conventional sense of the word. It's more like a giant centipede, which at 3 meters long is, well, yeah, rather terrifying. The giant crab as such, it's not actually a crab, it's a millipede or centipede, but still, is about 350 million years old, and it belongs to a species that really we don't know a lot about. Some of it's well established, but some of it's just not. And one of the things we do know is that at the time, there was so much more oxygen available that species could be much bigger. And this is where the giant car-sized centipede comes into play in particular, trying to figure out just what it looked like. After all, knowing that it's just a giant, spiny, centipede-looking thing doesn't help us all that much because, well, we have those today, they're just smaller. What we need to know about is how it fed itself and what it did, and for that, we need its face. To get that information, they had to take CT scans of preserved juveniles from a mine in France, and this told us a lot about it, but we can't use any typical CT scan. It had to be a micro CT scan, which allows for even smaller details for something so tiny. The general information's actually interesting in that, well, they had some of the more predictable things. For example, they had antennae, the mouth parts were separated at their base, they were able to chew, and they were very similar to a centipede or millipede. But what they lacked was a venomous pincer, which is what most of the current equivalents currently have, and they may not have had eyes that are similar to what we were expecting. They could well have been compound eyes and maybe on a stalk. And going from ancient nightmare fuel to modern, possibly happy fuel, it's a vaccine that could theoretically neuter a dog for a year. Now, this might seem odd, but bear with us. As a general rule, the process of neutering or sterilizing your pet dog is generally quite invasive, whether it's male or female, and unfortunately it's also irreversible. Because of this, well, there are some pretty bad issues there. Mostly, well, if you decide later on in life, you know what, I'm really attached to my dog, I would love to have another one just like him or her. I want more of this fluff. Well, too bad. And if you were unfortunately somebody who went and thought, you know what, I might want another dog in the future and I might want to breed them, I'll leave them be, well, you're more likely to have issues around unexpected puppies, whether your dog has the puppies or your dog sires the puppies. And so we have some pretty big issues here. And also just the cost. Sometimes it's very expensive to get your animal neutered. This is where an antibody could be useful. It's a very similar idea that's being used in human clinical trials, just unsuccessfully in humans. And it does pretty much the same thing. It's antibodies to the various sex cells that allow for the production of either eggs or sperm. And it's very effective at blocking it. Understand, it's not yet available, although theoretically it will be, but the company responsible, that being Egolite, has tried to patent it in about 40 countries across the world, and theoretically this will cover North America, Europe, and a few other places as well. The other advantage to this is that it's significantly cheaper than the usual surgical neutering process, at roughly $50 American for each shot in Chile, let alone other countries. Next we shift to an item that's all about what people don't understand, and in short it's an article trying to criticize the fact that there is a regular conflict of interest, particularly in areas around reviewing manuscripts or articles before they're published for academic work. The conflict of interest being that many large drug and pharmaceutical companies are involved in, funding research, and therefore the reviewers are likely to have received a considerable amount of funding at some point from one or more of these companies, along with government funding. And, this shouldn't be a thing. In short, there are conflict of interest requirements when you review an article. The typical process is, if you have a conflict of interest, you either state it, and you can make a decision yourself if you feel that there are issues. If somebody else has concerns about you, they can raise them with the editor, and the editor can then discuss it with you, and then you can be taken off of that particular manuscript, which can happen for other reasons as well. And of course, if your conflict of interest is too extreme, you should probably have taken yourself off of it. But that's the thing here. Most big pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers not just put a lot of money into this field, because they want to eventually be able to use the developments in the field to make their own devices, drugs, etc., but also because, the people they're funding are also the same ones who will be reviewing it, and the reviewers do so for free. Effectively, they're all doing it on a voluntary basis, and because of that, the work they do has to be funded somehow. Typically speaking, the work they're doing is funded through the grants they receive, sometimes from these companies, and they then put that into doing whatever research they're trying to do, on top of their reviewing stuff, which is often out of hours and voluntary. So, no. This compares, let's say horribly, against actual misconduct. And this is all about Alzheimer's research. It's also Marc Tessier-Lavigne, who is a researcher who basically came to fame in 2009, and it was all arguing about how he'd found essentially the holy grail of Alzheimer's research, which sounds like it should be great, after all. If you've done this, clearly we have some way to chase, and we might even be able to find a cure for it. But no. And of course, he's not the only one. There's an entire thread dedicated to various researchers who have done this. Now, admittedly, there are only 6 they provide here, but they are 6 high-profile examples. And unfortunately, they're all high-profile examples that show that there's a pretty rotten core to some researchers, let's say, larger institutes. In other news, we now look at the actual, publishing about this, and first we begin with communication, and nature's attempt, and stupid attempt, to try and make it more inclusive. In this case, an article that complains about the use of various seasonal references, for example, whether you're using summer or winter. The complaint is basically, but what if you live in the opposite hemisphere? Well, yeah, you live in the opposite hemisphere. You should be aware of the fact that you live there, and that, given you're looking at something being hosted on the other side of the Earth, you may need to make some accounting for getting there and the various changes therein. It's not rocket science. Well, it might be rocket science, but the necessary steps are not. Mostly because, rocket science tends to be far more technologically advanced, and it doesn't require us pointing out that, such things are stupid. But nonetheless, nature tries to suggest things that we could fix. For example, avoiding naming seasons. No, again, fairly obvious. Provide specific dates and months, which is, yes, that's normal. You normally get told when a thing will happen. Otherwise, you're probably buying a ticket for a scam. There's questions about respecting the work-life balance, which that's an individual decision, and you don't need a nanny state to look after you. And then there's also the adjusting global analyses to account for hemispheric differences, which, again, it's just stupid. In other publisher news, we have Elsevier, and Elsevier has gone public. Understand, Elsevier is one of the major publishing groups in the world. There's only a handful of them, and they're responsible for something like 80% of all published research. The problem with Elsevier is that they started out effectively relying on public organizations to fund this research. Understand, that's not their very, very old origins, not the old law or the deep law, but instead relatively modern work. And what's important here is to understand that them going public essentially means that we have huge issues associated with what comes next. And we'll get to those shortly, but first of all, there's an excellent thread that talks about where Elsevier has come from, who they are, what they are, and how they've grown over time. The big issue we have with this is rather straightforward. If Elsevier goes public as they have, they're now requiring shareholders essentially to take responsibility for the company. Each individual who owns a share owns a small percentage of the company, often an infinitesimally small share of the company. Those same people will now lose the money they put into this if it doesn't make anything out of it. This means that they're expecting some return out of the business they own, or at least a share of the business that they own. That means Elsevier now needs to start increasing the cost to publish and the various other fees they have in order to make dividends for these individuals, along with paying all the other things they have to pay for. That means it's going to get increasingly more costly to publish, and that's going to suck a lot for academia, because it's already incredibly expensive to publish in most of the Elsevier journals, and especially the most prestigious of these. For example, if you wanted to publish in The Lancet, you're paying about $7,500 for open access. That is, you're paying all the costs so that others can then read it. Yeah, it's expensive, and admittedly the lower tier journals aren't much better, still at thousands of dollars to do so. It is also very much likely that the cost of these fees to publish will only keep going up year on year as they need to increase the dividend value and therefore increase the share price, which is unfortunately a balloon economy where it will inevitably burst. Next we have tech security news, and it's a weird occurrence where there is a problem or a security vulnerability in your email service at a university. And effectively, a student has found this and tried to solve it by sending an email that essentially impersonates the sender. And by doing this, they're able to confuse everybody into thinking that a class had been cancelled. This is where we should have had these kids watch Spider-Man in the early days, where they would understand the importance of great power and great responsibility, or the ability to spoof emails and the consequential effects. In other tech news, although this time we're moving instead to the SEC, and effectively somebody has now been charged for the felony of compromising the Twitter account that the SEC, or the Securities Exchange Commission of the United States of America, was using. Understand, this is coming out of the FBI, and essentially what's happened is that the person who's done this was nowhere near as good as the MIT idiot, because at least the MIT idiot was able to understand that you don't put your own email in this. That person did not, and unfortunately that means they were very easily found. Yeah, they made a rookie mistake, and they're going to pay for it, most likely with a very long prison sentence. In other tech news, but completely different kinds of tech news, Meta has fired staff in Los Angeles for, rather than using their meal credits to buy meals, they instead use them to buy household items. Odd, given that you are effectively given a 25 meal credit, you would presumably use it to buy the meal, and that would be the obvious and simple answer. But that's where things get a little more murky. Understand, Meta is offering free food to employees in its Silicon Valley headquarters, and it's a perk. It's intended to be a bonus. Now, rather than have it ordered through the canteen on site or similar, staff are instead able to order through, say, Uber Eats or Grubhub, and that allows them to bring food into the office. Admittedly, the allowances for this are quite extensive, with $20 for breakfast, $25 for lunch, and $25 for dinner. So they're not getting an insignificant amount of money each day, given that this is roughly $70 a day for, well, food. What's happened is that Meta has accused the individuals of abusing the food credit system over a long time because they would, instead of having meals delivered to them, use that same credit to buy other things. So, yeah, there's certainly a case to be made that they weren't behaving properly. But it does add up slightly differently when you look at what was happening. First of all, some of them were getting their meals sent home, so that's probably not the best thing to be doing. And of course that's an issue, but another thing that happened was that some of them would be buying things like toothpaste and tea. And because of this, they would be spending the money that was a perk for working in the office, well, not for working in the office. So yeah, this is not to say that the behavior should be dismissed. After all, the individuals who were fired were receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year as their salary or compensation, so it's not like they necessarily needed to save money. A company that does probably need to save money at the moment is Boeing, and Boeing has now had yet another debacle happen. One of its satellites has broken up in geostationary orbit. We're presuming somewhere somehow there is a box in the Boeing workspace that is called Lost and Found, and it's just full of bolts from things that shouldn't have bolts missing, whether it's airplanes or, in this case, satellites. Now, it's not necessarily a massive cause for panic, but admittedly the fragments from said satellite are something of a concern, and there's a surprisingly large number of them, and they are spread over a fairly big area. So there is some concern and possibility that they could theoretically cause issues around hitting other satellites and causing other accidents. But it seems like most companies aren't particularly concerned about that development. In news that's nowhere near believable, and it shouldn't be believable, is this image here, and, well, the fact that it's fake. In a manner of speaking. Understand, we say manner of speaking for a very important reason. First of all, it's entirely believable that a furry would be out in the forest and get shot, mostly because all furries should be shot on sight. Nonetheless, the reality of it is that, well, unfortunately, things aren't always so easy. The satirical image you see here is just that, satirical. If only furries would run around in the forest looking like a deer, life would be so much easier, and there'd be so many few furries. Finally, we have Elon Musk being sued for his humanoid robots. Yeah. The basic concept is, well, the concept art used for Blade Runner 2049 and the robots within it, apparently the inspiration for these robotic individuals. Of course, that's not really a fair call, given that they're basically the most boring and stereotypical humanoid robot. Make a humanoid head, make a humanoid torso, and basically copy and paste a mannequin from any kind of clothing store, and you have the Tesla robot. So the lawsuit, we're strongly expecting, will not go anywhere for very long. It's also not the only thing for which he's theoretically going to be sued. When the robotaxi was unveiled, there was an image used that looked decidedly similar to the Blade Runner 2049 image. And in that instance, there is a much better case to be made that there was copyright infringement. Although, again, it will take a considerable amount of litigation to make it go anywhere, and it may be much easier for Tesla and Musk to simply settle out of court. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.